Hello there. Tonight we are going to walk through the silent marble halls of forgotten European palaces. Picture it now: great cold rooms, lined with oil paintings of people you've never heard of, staring down at you with that vacant Habsburg expression, tight jaws, wide chins, and eyes that seem to know they were born to marry their cousins. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The night falls slowly over Europe's ancient palaces. You can almost hear the hush of servants drawing velvet curtains, the quiet sighs of maids smoothing heavy brocade sheets on royal beds no one ever really sleeps well in. These were not homes of peace, but prisons of heritage. And tonight, we are wandering quietly into the very heart of one of history's strangest stories, of love, blood, and inevitability. The story of Leopold of Austria and Margarita Teresa of Spain. It begins, as so many of these stories, do not with a grand romantic gesture, but with a family tree, or rather, a family circle. For the Habsburgs' marriage was never a matter of the heart. It was strategy, territory, dynasty, and every marriage further tangled the roots of this already overgrown looping tree. You didn't marry to find new blood, you married to keep the same blood, exactly where it had always been locked safely inside the family. The palaces may have been grand, the portraits impressive, but behind every smile, in oil paint lay generations of fear. Fear of losing land, of losing face, of losing power. And so they married each other, again and again. Uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, aunts to nephews, until faces began to blur together, until children were born, already carrying the weight of decisions made centuries before they ever drew breath. Leopold was born into this, a boy wrapped not just in silk, swaddling, but in expectation, in duty, in bloodlines, so tangled they made a mockery of God's own commandments. His birth was greeted with relief, another Habsburg boy, another link in the chain. His parents were proud, if not exactly affectionate. They had done what they were meant to do, produced another heir, another pawn, another child to inherit not just land and titles, but jawlines that jutted too far, and minds perhaps already fraying at the edges. Even as a baby, Leopold was watched with more scrutiny than tenderness. His tutors would later comment, not on his laughter or his smile, but on the angle of his brow, the firmness of his grip, the clarity of his lineage. No one spoke of his soul, only his suitability. Outside the palace walls, Europe shifted uneasily. Wars flickered across maps, borders blurred, but inside the Habsburgs clung tighter to their traditions, to their titles, to each other. And little Leopold was raised to understand, one thing above all, your duty is to your blood. Protect it, preserve it, expand it if you can, but never dilute it. And across the continent, in another palace, no less gilded and no less grim, a baby girl was born into much the same fate. Her name was Margarita Teresa. She would be his niece, his cousin, his future wife. But tonight they are just two children, asleep beneath painted ceilings, their futures already sealed beneath signatures on parchment they would never even be asked to read. For now the night is still. The great palaces hold their breath, and somewhere in the darkness, another candle guttered out. The Habsburgs did not invent the idea of royal blood staying royal. Marriages between cousins, nieces, and uncles had existed long before their dynasty came to power. But the Habsburgs perfected it. They refined it into an art form, so precise, so deliberate, that it shaped the very bones of their children. To understand why they did this, why they sacrificed fresh alliances and possibilities for the same weary, narrowing pool of relatives, you have to understand the world they lived in. Europe of the 1600s was not a continent of nations the way we think of it now. It was a chessboard of dynasties. Every king, every emperor, every duke lived in fear of one thing above all else: losing land. Land was wealth. Land was soldiers. Land was food power and leverage. And the only thing worse than losing land to war was losing it through marriage. So the solution was simple: keep the land in the family. And to keep the land in the family, you had to keep the blood in the family too. A daughter married outside the family might take her lands with her, gift them to her husband's dynasty, and dilute the power her ancestors had so carefully hoarded. A son who married a stranger might bring in foreign blood, foreign claims, foreign loyalties. Better to marry within. Better to wed your cousin, your niece, your uncle, than risk on stranger's hand laying claim to your crown. The Habsburgs understood this, perhaps better than anyone. Their motto could well have been, better a Habsburg cousin than a Bourbon enemy. Their empire sprawled not through conquest alone, but through marriage contracts inked in candlelight. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, all tangled together in a web of silk and signatures. And it worked for a time. The family grew rich. Their holdings expanded. Their portraits lined the walls of palaces from Madrid to Vienna. But the price of this strategy was written not in treaties, but in genes. As generations passed, the family tree began to curve back upon itself. The same names repeated. Maria Anna married Ferdinand. Ferdinand's cousin married Maria Anna's daughter. Their children married each other. The same faces appeared again and again: broad foreheads, jutting chins, pale complexions stretched over bones too fragile, or jaws too heavy. The Habsburg jaw became a mark of lineage, a badge of honor, worn upon the face, even as it made eating, speaking, even breathing more difficult with each successive birth. Doctors knew little of genetics then, but even they whispered of the dangers, of madness in the blood, of bodies too weak to bear the weight of royal expectations. Still the marriages continued, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Fear of strangers, fear of dilution, fear of loss. And so we find ourselves back with Leopold. Born into this carefully maintained spiral, he knew no other world. His parents were cousins. Their parents were cousins. His family gatherings resembled small court audiences, the same faces seated beneath portraits of their identical ancestors, the same conversations repeated over and over about duty, about blood, about the preservation of what had always been. Leopold grew up learning his future wife might well share his blood more closely than a sister. It was expected. It was celebrated. A marriage outside the family might be scandalous. A marriage within was prudent, strategic, necessary. Across the Pyrenees, in the grand, gloomy halls of the Spanish court, Margarita Teresa was being raised with the same understanding. Her dolls wore crowns. Her bedtime stories were of alliances and heirs, not fairy tales. She knew from the cradle that her heart would never belong to her. It belonged to Spain, to Austria, to the Habsburg name. And so 2 children, bound by blood and bound by duty, moved steadily toward each other across the map of Europe. Their paths were written in ink long before they could read. Their futures secured by parents who looked not to love, but to lineage, The family tree curved inwards once again. Leopold was born into gold, but gold can be cold. His childhood was spent beneath ceilings, painted with angels in rooms where footsteps echoed too loud, and laughter seemed to vanish into heavy drapes. Servants hovered, tutors corrected, priests warned, and always the portraits watched stern ancestors with the same protruding jaws and narrowed eyes reminding him who he was, who he must be, and what he could never become. He was not born to be free. He was born to uphold, to preserve, to continue. Every lesson he learned reinforced this. His handwriting must be precise, his Latin flawless, his understanding of treaties and genealogies unquestioned. But he need not learn joy, or friendship, or the thrill of a summer's day beyond the palace gardens. Those things were for lesser boys, for sons of merchants or farmers, or men without coats of arms. Leopold was to be emperor. His life was already written. He wore stiff collars and stiffer manners. He learned to bow deeper than he smiled. His letters home, carefully scripted, spoke of duty, never dreams. His tutors praised his seriousness, his sense of responsibility. They did not speak of warmth or kindness. They noted his diligence, his lack of rebellion, and saw these as virtues. They never wondered what such a boy might long for in the quiet dark of his chambers. Outside the world crept on. Plagues came and went. Wars flared, smoldered, ignited again. But within those palace walls, life followed a slower rhythm. Ceremonial breakfasts, solemn masses, audiences where words weighed more than actions. And beneath it all, the steady beat of duty, duty, duty. Leopold had few friends. Other princes were competitors, potential threats. His siblings were pawns, future marriages to be played on the board of Europe. He trusted no one completely, for trust was weakness, and weakness had no place in the halls of power. Instead, he turned inward. He read. He prayed. He composed music, careful fugues that wound back upon themselves, looping endlessly, without escape, perhaps a mirror of his own bloodline. He was taught that God had ordained his family's place, that the sufferings of others were beneath his notice, save as matters of policy, that a Habsburg must rule with firmness, with distance, with the heavy weight of history pressing down upon his spine. So he stood straight. He held his tongue. He did as expected. But sometimes at night he wondered, what did it mean to be emperor? To inherit a throne built on generations of children just like him, silent, obedient, bent beneath the same crushing expectations. Did he dream of escape of forests without boundaries of songs, sung without fear of impropriety perhaps? But those dreams were like smoke, flickering, fading gone by dawn. The court loved him for his seriousness. His portraits show a man already burdened by his future, even as a boy. His eyes do not sparkle. His mouth rarely lifts. He learned early how to hide himself beneath robes of ceremony, how to let others see only what they wished a prince prepared a son worthy, a Habsburg through and through. And in Spain, far away, but bound by the same invisible chains, Margarita Teresa grew beneath the same weight, but her world was even narrower. She would not rule. She would not inherit. She would be given, wrapped in silk, shipped across borders, handed over to cement alliances her heart had no say in. She played beneath chandeliers, listened to whispers, behind fans learned to smile without speaking her mind. 2 lives, 2 palaces moving toward each other with the slow inevitability of tides. Neither child free, neither child truly seen for who they were beneath the trappings of royalty. The portraits watched, The bloodlines waited, and the future drew closer, step by careful step. Margarita Teresa was not born for love. She was born for diplomacy, for treaties, for the preservation of her father's fragile empire. From her first breath, she belonged to others, to Spain, to Austria, to her family's long, weary line of rulers. Even as an infant, she was marked not by affection, but by expectation. Her birth was celebrated in court, not for the joy of a new life, but for the possibilities her small body carried another link in the endless chain of alliances, another pawn to move across Europe's chessboard of blood and land. Her world was one of suffocating grandeur, gilded cradles, silk canopies, nurses who curtsied before lifting her, tutors who bowed before teaching her letters she would only write in the service of others. She grew beneath heavy portraits of ancestors, with the same pale skin, the same pale eyes, the same sense of duty pressed like lead into their bones. There were no fairy tales in her nursery, only lessons in lineage, who she descended from, who she would marry, what her womb would one day be expected to produce. She learned early to walk beneath the weight of expectation, to speak in the careful tones of a princess who might one day hold the fate of nations between her gloved hands. Her father, Philip the Thorn, was a man bound by the same chains he wrapped around his daughter. His own marriage had been a political necessity, a union of niece and uncle that raised eyebrows and silenced questions with gold. He looked upon Margarita not as a father might, but as a king must. She was valuable, precious, not for her laughter, her wit, her dreams, but for the treaties she might seal with a wedding band. And so the threads were drawn tighter. Austria watched. Spain plotted. The Habsburg tree prepared to curl inward once more. When Margarita was still little more than a child, plans were already in motion. Leopold, distant yet close in blood, was the clear choice, heir to Austria's fractured throne. A cousin in blood, a future husband in ink. Portraits were exchanged long before they would exchange words. Couriers carried likenesses across mountains and seas, scrutinized by advisors who measured noses, chins, foreheads, as if the union of two nations could be foretold in the tilt of a young girl's head. Margarita was shown his likeness. Perhaps she was told he would be kind, that he would be gentle, that he would love her. Lies wrapped in lace and protocol. What mattered was not affection, but alliance. She grew up with this knowledge pressing down on her, like the weight of her heavy skirts. One day, she would leave. One day, she would be given away, not as a woman, but as an offering. Her tears would matter less than her signature on a marriage contract. Her happiness, less than the territories her children might inherit. At 15, she was deemed ready, or rather, ready enough, ready to travel across Europe, ready to meet the man who would become her husband, her cousin, her emperor, ready to play her part in a story older than either of them, written not in love, but in blood. Her portrait had been accepted. The alliance was approved. The arrangements were made. And so Margarita began her journey, not toward freedom, not toward love, but toward Vienna's cold embrace. Behind her, Spain faded. Ahead, Austria loomed. And all around, the portraits watched unblinking. The road from Madrid to Vienna was long, not just in distance, but in symbolism. For Margarita Teresa, this was not a journey to a new life. It was a slow surrender of the only life she had ever known. Each mile carried her further from Spain, from her language, her customs, her home, and deeper into the heart of a family that already owned her in blood, and now would own her in name. She was just 15, too young to carry the weight of an empire on her delicate shoulders, and yet old enough in the eyes of kings and courtiers to bear children and secure alliances. Her departure was marked by ceremony. A procession gifts tears carefully wiped away beneath veils. But beneath the silks and jewels, a girl sat quietly, knowing her fate had been sealed long before this journey ever began. Her route was slow and deliberate, from Madrid through Denia in southern Spain, then by ship across to Genoa in Italy. From there, overland through Venice, then northward to Vienna. Every stop a reminder of how far she had yet to go every night in a foreign inn, another whisper that she would never truly come home again. Letters traveled ahead of her, couriers announcing her progress, her health, her demeanor. Reports to Vienna assured Leopold she was fair, obedient, prepared, as if she were a parcel in transit, not a girl with thoughts, fears, or dreams of her own. And what did she think on those long, jolting rides through strange countryside? Did she gaze from her carriage and wonder what life might have been if she were born a baker's daughter, free to choose love over duty? Or did she simply count the days until her journey's end, until her role as niece, cousin, and bride could be fulfilled, and she could stop pretending to hope? When she finally arrived in Vienna, it was winter. Snow softened the city's hard edges. The palace loomed cold and grand, its halls unfamiliar, its servants strangers, speaking a tongue not her own. There was no time to rest, no gentle welcome. The marriage had been planned to the hour, and the consummation expected without delay. Leopold greeted her with the stiff courtesy of a man, meeting not a wife, but an obligation fulfilled. Portraits hadn't lied. She was pale, slight, lovely in the way a porcelain doll is lovely, fragile, and distant. They spoke in formal phrases. They posed for formal portraits. They performed their roles. Within months, Margarita was pregnant. A son was born, sickly and weak. Like his mother, he bore the weight of generations in his veins. His survival was brief. His loss was expected. And so the pattern began. Pregnancies, miscarriages, brief flickers of hope extinguished by biology, older and stronger than either of them. Through it all, Margarita remained a figure of quiet endurance. She wrote letters home, speaking of longing, of loneliness, of a body that betrayed her more with each passing year. Vienna did not love her. Austria did not understand her. She was Spanish in her dress, her manners, her heart, a foreign queen in a foreign land, carrying the burden of both families' ambitions in a womb already exhausted. And through it all, the portraits watched. Leopold watched. The court watched, waiting, hoping, for what exactly? A healthy heir, a happy marriage, or merely the continuation of a name, a face, a bloodline already too frayed to repair? The palace in Vienna became Margarita's golden cage. Within its heavy walls and endless halls, she was both queen and prisoner. Isolated by language, by custom, by duty, she found herself surrounded not by friends or family, but by strangers in powdered wigs who spoke a tongue she barely understood and followed traditions that were never hers. Her ladies-in-waiting were Spanish brought with her as a small comfort. They spoke in hushed voices, clung together in corners of grand empty rooms, like shadows from a life she could never return to. Together, they created a small island of Madrid within the vast foreign sea of Austria's court. They brought Spanish customs, Spanish prayers, Spanish tears, but nothing could bring her home. Her health faltered. An enlarged thyroid made breathing difficult. her body swollen in ways that doctors could neither explain nor cure. They prescribed tonics, prayers, leeches, all the rituals of 17th century medicine, none of which addressed the root cause. A young woman born too many times, into the same family tree, forced too soon into a body's burdens. Loneliness gnawed at her. Letters home became her refuge, her only connection to the life she had lost. In them, she confessed to homesickness, to sorrow to a body that failed her, again and again. Vienna's cold made her ache. The foreignness of everything around her made her withdraw further into herself. She dreamed of Spain, of warm evenings, of familiar voices, of a world where she had been a girl, and not yet a wife, a mother, a failed hope wrapped in velvet. Leopold, for his part, was said to care for her deeply, not perhaps as a lover, but as a man who recognized in her the same chains he wore himself. He admired her endurance, her quiet grace. He longed for an heir, yes, but he also mourned each loss beside her understanding that these losses were not only personal, but political echoes of a family crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions. Yet his care did not ease her suffering. He continued to do what duty demanded. He visited her, shared meals with her, slept beside her. And when she was well enough, he ensured she was pregnant again, hoping each time that this child might survive where the others had not. Over the years, Margarita became a ghost within the palace. Her once bright beauty dimmed by sickness, her steps slower, her smiles rarer. She kept to her rooms, surrounded by tapestries from Spain, by relics of a home that seemed more dream than memory. Servants learned to speak softly around her, to move carefully, as if noise alone might shatter her fragile frame. Outside, Vienna thrived. Wars continued. Treaties were signed. Life marched on in corridors where Margarita no longer walked. Within, she waited, for health to return, for a child to live, for letters from home, for anything to change. But nothing changed. Only time passed, and with it her strength faded. And still, the portraits watched. Her face captured in oils, in silks, in jewels forever young, forever pale, forever distant. A queen in name, a prisoner in truth. Another link in a chain, too long, too heavy, too cruel to break. The marriage between Margarita Teresa and Leopold had been decided long before either of them understood what such a bond truly meant. For the Habsburgs' marriage was never an affair of the heart. It was a cold strategic tool used to protect borders, secure alliances, and most importantly, keep bloodlines tightly contained within the family. For generations, this was how they maintained their empire, not through conquest alone, but through signatures on marriage contracts and unions carefully arranged between cousins and uncles, nieces and aunts. So it was with Margarita. Her wedding to Leopold was planned with the same precision as a military campaign. Portraits were exchanged across borders, letters filled with praise and reassurances crossed mountains and seas. Dowries were calculated down to the last coin. Ministers on both sides examined not only titles and estates, but also bloodlines, ensuring this marriage would strengthen the already suffocating tangle of Habsburg ancestry. That she was his niece, his cousin, his kin, through nearly every convoluted branch of their family tree was not a problem. It was a requirement. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, Vienna spared no expense. The city dressed itself in splendor, draping garlands over stone archways, lining streets with banners, filling churches with choirs and incense. Bells rang across the rooftops, while nobles in silks and velvets murmured behind jeweled fans. Their whispers were not of romance, but of power, of dynasties, of how this marriage would secure the future. To the world, this was a glorious occasion. To the court, it was simply necessary. Beneath all this grandeur stood a girl of 15, pale, exhausted from the long journey from Spain, already bearing the invisible weight of expectations laid upon her from birth. Margarita did not stand at the altar filled with joy or anticipation. She stood because she must, because duty, blood, and empire demanded it. The words spoken were not hers. The future being built did not belong to her. Her smile was not for Leopold, nor for herself. It was for the courtiers, the ambassadors, the history books waiting to record her image. Leopold met her with the reserved courtesy expected of a man raised in halls, where duty silenced affection. He had seen her portrait read the reports of her beauty, her breeding, her impeccable suitability as empress. Now that she stood before him, none of that mattered beyond what her lineage could secure for him. This marriage was not about companionship, nor about the comforts of marriage as poets imagine them. It was about heirs, about survival, about preserving a bloodline already thinned and frayed by centuries of such unions. Their wedding night came as expected, not as a moment of tenderness, but as another duty to be fulfilled. Consummation was a legal requirement, a proof demanded by treaties, by dynasties, by the unspoken expectations of history itself. In a foreign room, beneath heavy draperies, Margarita became a wife not through affection, but through obligation. In the months that followed, she settled into her role with the quiet resignation expected of her. Vienna, with its cold, unfamiliar air and endless labyrinth of etiquette, became her prison of silk and ceremony. She withdrew into herself, her days measured out in formalities, audiences, masses, endless dinners where she sat silent beneath chandeliers, her face painted in politeness. Her world shrank to letters sent back to Spain, written in a hand that grew fainter with each passing month. In them she spoke not of love, but of longing for sunlight, for familiar voices, for the warmth of a land that no longer seemed reachable. Around her, ladies in waiting spoke in whispers of home, clinging to fragments of a life left far behind. Outside her chambers, Vienna marched on. Ministers plotted alliances. Shifted wars continued. Inside, Margarita learned to navigate her own kind of battlefield, one of silence, of endurance, of loneliness wrapped in velvet and lace. And always portraits were painted, images of a young empress, serene, adorned in jewels, her gaze turned somewhere far beyond the frame. Portraits destined to outlive her, to hang in halls, long after her name faded into whispers. Portraits telling a story of duty fulfilled, of bloodlines preserved even as the girl within them quietly disappeared. The journey from Madrid to Vienna had been long, but the journey from girl to queen was even longer and far more difficult. Margarita's days settled into a rhythm of duty and waiting. Waiting for letters, waiting for health, waiting for something to change. But change was not a luxury afforded to Habsburg queens. In Spain, she had been beloved, a princess of promise. In Austria, she was a foreigner with a fragile body and a womb deemed too valuable to fail. She lived not as herself, but as a symbol, a living treaty between two great houses, her every breath monitored by those who cared less for her happiness than for the potential heirs she might deliver. Her pregnancies followed one another like the changing of seasons. Some ended in miscarriage, quiet and mourned in whispers. Others brought forth children who gasped for breath and failed to thrive. Each loss chipped away at her strength, at her spirit, until even the courtiers whispered of her fading. Leopold watched this decline with a sorrow he rarely voiced. In his way, he cared for Margarita perhaps more than anyone expected from a man born to duty. He visited her chambers, sat beside her as she embroidered, read aloud from Spanish books she missed. Yet for all his presence, he could not save her from the slow erosion of her health, from the weight of expectations crushing her from within. The court grew restless. An heir was needed, a living, breathing continuation of the Habsburg line. Without it, treaties frayed, alliances wavered. And so Leopold, even as he mourned, pressed on. Each pregnancy was greeted with cautious hope, each miscarriage with tightening lips and lowered eyes. Margarita withdrew further. Her world shrank to her chambers, to gardens viewed through the frosted glass, to letters that arrived less and less frequently from home. The Spanish ladies who remained grew silent, their presence a comfort and a sorrow, both. Together they stitched prayers into linen, hoping thread might hold where blood had failed. Outside, Vienna bustled. Festivals, politics, wars. The world turned on without her. Inside, time slowed. Days blurred into months marked only by masses, for lost children and quiet birthdays no one celebrated. Her body betrayed her again and again. Illness lingered, infections took root. Physicians came and went, offering remedies with more confidence than results. Margarita bore it all with the quiet dignity expected of queens. Tears were shed in private strength worn in public. She grew thinner, paler. Portraits captured her with less light in her eyes, more shadow beneath her cheekbones. Yet still, she performed her role. She attended audiences when she could sat beside Leopold at state functions when required. Always smiling, always silent. A queen whose presence was more ghost than sovereign. Through it all, Leopold stayed, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of something closer to love. But even he could not halt the slow unraveling of the girl he had married. And as the seasons turned, Vienna prepared for what everyone now feared, but few dared to speak aloud. The queen was fading, and with her, a hope that had been frail from the very start. Vienna's grand halls grew quieter as Margarita's health declined. Her footsteps, once light and tentative, became rare. Her presence at court functions faded until she was spoken of more as a memory than a queen. The palace whispered of her in hushed tones, as if louder voices might hasten what all expected. The doctors did what they could, which was little. Bloodletting tonics, prayers, tools better suited for superstition than science. Some blamed the cold, the foreign air, her fragile constitution. But others, those who dared speak more honestly, behind closed doors, blamed the blood. The same blood that had been passed and repassed between uncles and nieces, cousins, and siblings for generations. Margarita's body bore the proof of that inheritance. Weak bones, fragile organs, a heart never quite strong enough to carry the burden placed upon it. She moved less. She slept more. The great halls of Vienna echoed with absence. Leopold remained devoted in his way. He visited her chambers daily, bringing small comforts, flowers from the gardens. She could no longer walk. Music played softly by court musicians just outside her doors. He sat with her in silence, sometimes reading aloud from letters she was too tired to open herself. They spoke less of the future and more of memories, of Spain's sunlit courtyards, of childhood games long past, of moments that seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. The court, for all its pomp and ceremony, grew uneasy. An emperor without an heir was a weakness no treaty could hide. Plans were whispered, alliances reconsidered, futures quietly redrawn. Yet no one dared speak of remarriage, not while Margarita still breathed, not while Leopold still lingered at her side, holding her hand with a tenderness that surprised those who had thought him made only of iron and duty. Winter settled over Vienna once more. The palace grew colder, darker, its great windows rimmed with frost. Inside, Margarita's world shrank further still, to her bed, to the quiet prayers of her ladies, to the slow, steady ticking of clocks marking time she no longer counted. She grew thinner, her skin translucent beneath the weight of illness. Portraits captured her likeness still, but even the artists seemed to paint with softer hands, as if already memorializing rather than recording the living. Her letters home became shorter, fewer, filled with longing for things beyond her reach. Warmth, laughter, the sight of familiar faces. Spain felt impossibly far away, and through it all, the portraits watched. Leopold watched, Vienna watched, waiting, always waiting for what they knew must come. The end approached, not with drama, but with silence. A breath fainter than the last. A hand falling still beneath embroidered sheets. And with her passing, something else faded too. A hope for unity between Spain and Austria. A bond written not just in ink and treaty, but in the fragile body of a girl who had never been free to live as she chose. Here is the rewritten part 10, in English per your request. Margarita is still alive. There is no funeral yet. The focus is on her worsening condition and how Vienna is preparing for what seems inevitable, but death has not come. The palace in Vienna grew quieter than ever. No one said it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Something was changing. Margarita's footsteps had become scarce. Her place at court dinners remained empty. People spoke of her less and less, and when they did, it was only in hushed tones behind closed doors, as if everyone understood that the end was slowly drawing closer. The doctors continued their rituals, tonics, prayers, the old methods no one truly believed in anymore. Some blamed the climate, the foreign air, her frail constitution. But those who understood better knew the truth. It was the blood. The same blood passed between uncles and nieces, cousins and siblings for generations. It was her own blood, undoing her from within. Her body was gradually giving up. Fevers lingered without breaking. Her limbs ached constantly. Each breath seemed to take more effort than the one before. She slept longer, ate less, spoke rarely, and her dreams stretched on and on. The doctors quietly retreated from the rooms thick with the scent of medicines. No one dared say it aloud, but everyone knew they could do no more. Leopold stayed by her patient silent. He brought flowers from the gardens. She could no longer walk, ordered soft music, played outside her chambers, so she wouldn't feel alone. He read to her from letters sent from Spain, letters filled with concern, with gentle encouragement, with news that barely seemed to stir her anymore. When she was awake and lucid, they spoke more often of the past than the future, of Spanish gardens, under warm sun, of childhood, of things that now seemed impossibly distant. The court had begun preparing for the inevitable. They spoke cautiously of heirs of politics, of future alliances. They did not yet speak of funerals, but all understood in their hearts that the day would come. They knew it, but no one dared to speak it first. Vienna was slipping into winter. Frost crept over the windows, the palace gathering another layer of cold. Inside that quiet room, Margarita's world had shrunk to her bed, to the whispered prayers of her ladies-in-waiting, to the slow ticking of clocks. marking time she no longer counted. She had grown so fragile, it seemed even light feared to touch her. Portraits of her continued to be painted, but the artist's hands worked softly now, not to capture the living, but to prepare to say farewell. Her letters home grew fewer, shorter, filled with longing for the smallest things she knew she would not see again. Warmth, laughter, familiar faces. Spain seemed impossibly far away, and throughout these quiet days, the portraits still watched her. Leopold watched her. Vienna watched her. And all waited for what they all knew must come. But not yet. Not today. Pregnancy became Margarita's quiet war. With each new hope came fear, and with each loss, a deeper silence settled over her life. Those around her offered sympathy in the polite, rehearsed manner of court. But no one, not even Leopold, could ease the truth that grew heavier. With every miscarriage, her body was failing her, and with it, the hopes of an empire. The Habsburg jaw, the Habsburg blood. These were things spoken of with pride in public, but whispered about in private with a kind of dread. Generations of intermarriage had left its marks not just on faces, but on health, on minds, on the fragile scaffolding of life itself. Margarita's suffering was not unique among her ancestors, but it was hers to bear day after day, behind heavy doors, in rooms that grew darker with each passing season. Her days blurred into sameness, morning prayers, small meals, short, careful walks when she could manage, embroidery when her hands were steady enough to hold a needle, letters when her mind was clear enough to write. She wrote often of Spain, of missing the warmth, the language, the familiar faces that seemed more dream than memory now. Sometimes she wrote of Leopold, his kindness, his patience, his loneliness that mirrored her own. More often, she wrote of the children she could not keep. The palace grew quieter as she withdrew. Servants learned to step softly, to speak gently, to dim lights and soften sounds. Musicians played softer pieces outside her doors. Courtiers learned to stop asking after her health, and instead inquired after the emperor's mood, his plans, his future. Her body betrayed her in new ways. Fevers lingered. Her limbs ached. She tired, easily slept, often dreamed of things she no longer believed she would live to see. Doctors offered comfort without cure. Priests offered prayers without answers. And through it all, Margarita endured with a dignity that seemed more ghost than girl. Leopold did what he could. He shielded her from the harshest of court's expectations, allowed her seclusion, protected her privacy. But he could not protect her from the weight of her own bloodline, from the centuries of decisions that had led to this moment. This marriage, this slow unraveling of a life too fragile to bear the burden placed upon it. And so she waited, for the seasons to turn, for the pain to ease, for news from home, for the faint hope that another child might live. But hope grew thin as her breath, as pale as her skin beneath the heavy veils she wore even indoors. Outside her windows, Vienna moved forward. Inside her rooms, time slowed, stretched, seemed to pause altogether. And through it all, the portraits watched, eyes painted in oil lips, pressed in silent judgment, generations of faces, just like hers, bearing witness to the cost of keeping bloodlines pure. The Habsburg jaw was not just a quirk of genetics. It was a symbol, a warning and a curse. It marked the cost of keeping bloodlines pure, the consequence of centuries of choosing cousins over strangers, uncles over allies. In portraits, it was a badge of lineage. In life, it was a sentence written into bone. Margarita's own features bore it lightly, but it lived in her blood more deeply than anyone could see. The deformities that plagued her ancestors had become invisible burdens within her weaknesses past, not through appearance, but through organs, through breath, through the fragile thread of life itself. Each failed pregnancy, each fever, each gasp for air, traced its roots, not to fate, but to generations of choices made long before she was born. Her brother Charles II of Spain bore these marks more visibly. His body twisted by inherited defects, his mind clouded, his health a daily battle. He was the culmination of this lineage, the living proof of what inbreeding had wrought. But Margarita's suffering was no less profound for being less visible. Where Charles wore his deformities in his gait and his jaw, she carried hers in the silence of her chambers, in the absence of children's laughter, where there should have been heirs. The court understood this, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. They knew why her pregnancies failed, why her health faltered. They understood the danger of the blood they prized so highly. But pride forbade change. Tradition forbade questioning. And so the circle continued tighter and tighter until there was no space left to breathe. Leopold watched and wondered if he too would succumb to this legacy. His jaw bore the mark. His blood ran thick with the same lineage. His hopes for children grew more desperate with each loss, not just for love or posterity, but to prove to himself, to his court, to history, that the line could go on. But as Margarita faded, so did those hopes. The realization settled like dust over Vienna's marble halls. Some things could not be willed into being. No ceremony, no prayer, no power could undo what generations had done. And yet life continued. Leopold ruled. Wars were waged. Treaties signed. The empire lumbered on beneath its weight of history. But within its gilded heart, something fragile had broken. Not just a woman, not just a marriage, a legacy crumbling beneath the weight of its own pride. In her quiet, unseen way, Margarita had become a symbol not of unity, not of strength, but of the silent cost of ambition, carried too far for too long in the name of dynasty. And still the portraits watched, eyes unblinking, jaws unyielding, silent witnesses to the price paid in blood. Leopold's affection for Margarita grew quietly, like ivy creeping along stone, not in grand gestures, not in the declarations of poets, but in small, steady acts. A chair pulled closer to the window so she might feel a sliver of sun, a book left open beside her bed, a shawl draped across her shoulders without a word. He was not a man known for softness. His reign was marked by war, by treaties, by the careful balancing of powers. But within the stillness of Margarita's chambers, he became something gentler. Perhaps he saw in her the reflection of his own confinement, the chains of blood, of expectation, of duty. Or perhaps he simply understood what it was to be trapped in a life written by others. He sat with her through long afternoons when words felt too heavy. He listened as she spoke of Spain, of childhood, of gardens and songs, and things that seemed impossibly distant now. Sometimes he answered. More often, he simply held her hand in silence. The court watched this devotion with a mixture of respect and curiosity. It softened Leopold's image, the cold emperor transformed for a time into a man capable of quiet tenderness. Yet even their sympathy could not change the truth Margarita was slipping away. And with her, the fragile thread tying Spain and Austria together grew thinner with each passing day. The ladies of her household tended to her like Nanians, at vigil keeping her surrounded by small comforts, scented linens, soft music, whispered prayers. They wrote letters home with careful phrasing, downplaying the severity of her condition. but truth lingers in tone, in gaps between words. Those in Madrid understood. They burned candles beneath altars, sent relics, offered prayers across the miles. Margarita moved, less, spoke less, but she watched. Through the tall windows, she traced the seasons, changing in the gardens. She no longer walked. Through the doors, left ajar, she listened to the life of the court moving on, without her voices rising and falling footsteps, echoing along marbled halls. She existed between these worlds, now neither fully present nor fully gone. Leopold began to plan less for the future. His ministers pressed for answers, for heirs, for alliances. He gave them none. His time was spent not in council chambers, but beside a woman who had taught him, perhaps too late, the weight of quiet devotion. And so Vienna waited. Seasons shifted. Portraits gathered dust. And in the stillness of those fading days, Leopold held her hand and wondered if this too was love. The children came, and the children went. Margarita's pregnancies blurred together in the whispers of the court, in the records of midwives, in the prayers offered beneath vaulted ceilings. A miscarriage here, a stillbirth there, an infant born too frail to survive the turning of a season. Each tiny life barely begun before it ended, each loss another weight pressing down upon her failing body. Of all the children she bore, only one survived beyond infancy, a daughter named Antonia. Pale, delicate, her health a daily question. Courtiers remarked in hushed voices that even if she lived, she bore in her veins the same curse that had plagued her mother, her uncle brother Charles Tangs, the whole tangled tree of Habsburg blood. Antonia was not the future they had hoped for. She was a living reminder of all that could not be escaped. Leopold and Margarita cherished her nonetheless. In her tiny hands, they placed their quiet hopes. In her fragile breaths, they listened for signs of strength. They walked with her in the palace gardens. When she was well enough, read to her from books heavy with stories of kings and queens, as if legacy alone might keep her standing. But the court knew better. They had seen too many children like Antonia, too many heirs with the same pale skin, the same hollow eyes, the same thin blood, too weak to carry a dynasty forward. They watched her with polite smiles and private doubt, wondering how long she might last, wondering how long the Habsburgs could pretend the line hadn't already frayed beyond repair. Margarita grew weaker with each passing year. Antonia, despite her fragility, grew taller. Sometimes the two seemed to mirror one another. Mother fading, daughter rising, though neither truly well, neither truly free of the weight that bound them both. Leopold watched them with a quiet grief. He had wanted sons. He had wanted strength. But in the end, he was left with only this, a daughter as delicate as glass, and a wife who barely clung to life. The empire demanded heirs. History demanded continuity. But life cared little for either. Life took what it pleased, when it pleased, and left kings and queens to mourn in silence. Vienna, too, learned silence. The court spoke less of the future, more of the past. Ministers drafted plans beneath portraits of ancestors who had once seemed immortal. They watched Antonia grow and wondered if she would outlive them all or none of them. And in the heart of the palace, beneath ceilings, heavy with gold, Margarita held her daughter close and wondered if love could be enough to outlast the legacy written in their blood. Antonia's survival was something of a miracle, though no one dared say it aloud. Each year she lived felt like a quiet defiance against the history written in her blood. Yet with each passing season, whispers followed her through the halls of her frailty, her pallor, the shadow of her lineage trailing close behind. Her mother watched her with a tenderness sharpened by fear. Margarita knew better than anyone how fragile life could be beneath the weight of expectation. She saw in Antonia not just a daughter, but a fragile thread tying together two crumbling empires. A child who had been born more out of duty than love, yet loved fiercely for simply surviving. Leopold too grew softer in Antonia's presence. He had wanted sons strong and proud to carry his name into the future. But this girl, with her quiet steps and two large eyes, became something different to him. She became his redemption, his proof that even beneath the heaviest chains, life could still bloom, however delicately. Yet the court did not share in this quiet hope. They watched Antonia's progress with a polite detachment, noting each cough, each pale day, each sign that the blood would claim her, as it had claimed so many before. Ministers prepared contingency plans. Marriages were discussed alliances weighed not for Antonia herself, but for the empire that might one day lose her. Margarita shielded her daughter as best she could. Lessons were gentle tutors chosen for their kindness rather than rigor. Time was spent in gardens, in music, in soft stories whispered at dusk. She wrapped Antonia not in politics, but in tenderness, hoping perhaps foolishly that love might succeed where duty had always failed. Still Vienna watched. Still history pressed forward. Antonia's future was written in ink on scrolls she would never see, her name linked to treaties she would never understand. Her mother knew this. Her father knew it, and yet within their private rooms they held on to something. History could not quite touch the simple, desperate hope that this child might outlive the expectations crushing them all. Margarita's health waned as Antonia's childhood stretched on. They walked together less, sat together more. Words became fewer glances, heavier with the things unsaid. In those quiet moments, beneath portraits of ancestors with the same weary eyes, mother and daughter existed in a fragile peace, caught between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. And always the portraits watched, silent witnesses to a family, slowly fading one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Margarita did not live to see her 22nd birthday. When the end came, it was neither sudden nor unexpected. It crept slowly through the halls of Vienna, step by silent step, long before the moment her body surrendered. Everyone who had watched her, pale and fade over the past years, knew how this story would end. There had been no illusions, no miracles, only the steady unraveling of a life too fragile, too burdened, and too isolated to withstand the weight history had placed upon her. Her final days passed in silence. The curtains remained drawn. The fire burned low, the heavy chill of winter pressing in against the thick velvet drapes, as if trying to seep into her bones. Servants moved softly around her, speaking in whispers, their faces carefully composed. Doctors still came offering their tonics and prayers, though all knew there was nothing left to cure. Priests visited murmuring last rites, not yet requested, but anticipated. Even Antonia, too young to grasp the fullness of what was happening, had grown quieter, clinging to her mother's hand as if she could keep her tethered to this world a little longer. Margarita herself had ceased to fight. Her breaths came light, slow, thin as silk thread. Speaking exhausted her. Even listening seemed beyond her most days. She no longer asked about Spain, no longer asked about Vienna, no longer asked about anything at all. She only lay beneath her layers of linen and velvet, her gaze drifting toward the window, though her vision seemed turned inward, toward some horizon only she could see. Leopold was with her, often more than any emperor was expected to be. His ministers waited in frustration outside her chambers, their papers and politics growing stale as weeks turned to months. Yet he stayed seated beside her bed, reading aloud from letters she no longer heard or holding her hand in long stretches of silence. He brought her flowers still, though she no longer noticed them. He sat with Antonia on his knee, the three of them locked together in a portrait of stillness that no painter would ever capture. For history did not care for such quiet scenes. Leopold had ceased asking for miracles. He no longer prayed for her recovery, only for her peace. He had watched her waste away, day by day, seen the hollows deepen beneath her eyes, the breath grow fainter in her chest. He had known from the start how this would end. All of Vienna had known. Yet still, he remained. When the moment finally arrived, it was gentle. A breath thinner than the one before. A hand falling slack beneath his. No cry, no struggle. Only the soft hush of servants stepping back, the quiet sob of a lady in waiting, the priest's whispered prayer, finishing what had begun long ago. She died in silence as she had lived, not in the arms of love, nor beneath the weight of grandeur, but surrounded by duty, by history, by the threads of blood that had pulled her here. She left behind no sons, no great legacy, only a fragile daughter and a husband who had learned too late what it meant to love something so delicate it could never be kept. Vienna mourned her in the way Vienna mourned all its lost empresses. Black cloth was hung from windows. Bells tolled through snow-heavy streets. Solemn masses were read beneath marble domes. Courtiers whispered their condolences in carefully measured tones. Ministers resumed their plans for alliances, remarriage heirs, because that was the business of empires. Death, after all, was only a pause in the machinery of power. Leopold fulfilled his role. He walked behind her coffin, through halls hung with crape, stood at her burial, draped in black, accepted condolences with a bowed head. Yet, in the privacy of his chambers, he lingered beside her empty chair, fingers tracing the delicate letters she had written in a hand that grew weaker with each passing season. He kept her portrait, close tucked between religious icons, out of sight of the world that expected him to move on. Antonia was too young to understand why her mother would not wake again. The ladies spoke to her in soft voices of angels, of peace, of sleep. They wrapped her in warmth and whispered that her mother watched her now from above. But in the eyes of those who served the Habsburg house, the truth was plain: the blood had claimed another, as it always did. Outside Vienna prepared for spring. The empire did not falter. Bells rang again. Couriers carried new treaties. Carriages rolled through streets that no longer paused to notice the shadows behind closed doors. Life continued. Empires continued. History continued. Yet in the quiet of the Hofburg, there lingered a silence heavier than grief. A life had ended not with ceremony, but with exhaustion. A branch of the family tree had closed without triumph or tragedy, only the soft, inevitable end of something too fragile to last. And the portraits remained, watching, always watching, eyes unblinking beneath powdered wigs, and stiff lace faces bearing the same jutting jaw, the same weary gaze. They watched as Margarita faded from living memory, another silent casualty of duty of blood, of a history written in suffering. After Margarita's death, Vienna returned, as it always did, to its rhythm of processions, treaties, and politics. The court hung its black drapes, tolled its bells, and recited its prayers. But even as the last candle burned out in her honor, life beyond her silent chambers moved forward. Ministers resumed their plans. Diplomats spoke of futures beyond mourning. Marriages were arranged. Alliances negotiated. Vienna did not stop for long, not even for a young empress who had withered away before her time. The House of Habsburg remained. Leopold continued his reign, fulfilling his duties with the same quiet determination as before. In time, he remarried. In time, new heirs were born. Treaties were signed. Wars ignited and burned out. Empires shifted beneath the weight of history. On the surface, all seemed unchanged. The Habsburg eagle still perched atop banners, still stretched its wings across maps. Vienna still whispered of thrones and borders of bloodlines and power. But beneath it all, something had cracked. Those who paid attention could feel it, though no one dared name it aloud. The strength that had once carried the Habsburgs across centuries of conquest and diplomacy was fading. Not in grand defeat or violent revolution. No, the unraveling of great houses is rarely so dramatic. It happens slowly, in silences that grow heavier, in portraits gathering dust in names that begin to fade from whispered conversations. The mighty do not always fall with noise. Sometimes they simply disappear. Margarita's passing was only one thread in this quiet fraying, but it marked something final. She had been meant to bind Austria and Spain together, another careful stitch in a tapestry of power woven over generations. Instead, she had become a symbol of the cost of such ambitions, a girl sacrificed to the weight of blood and duty gone, before her name could shape the world as intended. Her death left no wars, no crises, only a hollow echo in the halls where once her footsteps had been heard. And in time, even that echo faded. History would not remember Margarita for her struggle. She would not be recorded among great queens, nor written into the tales of those who reshaped empires. Her story would slip between the cracks of larger narratives, a footnote at most in the annals of European power. But the House of Habsburg would continue briefly. Its name would endure a little longer on treaties and titles, its bloodline stretching forward through cousins and marriages hastily arranged to salvage what could be saved. Yet history, when it looked back, would not speak of these final flickers of existence. It would remember the Habsburgs for their golden age, for the splendor of courts where kings and queens walked beneath painted ceilings and danced in gilded halls, for the maps drawn in their name, borders shaped by their will, for an empire where the sun once never set, for crowns passed between siblings, for alliances sealed with marriages that stretched across oceans and continents. History would speak of grandeur, of opulence, of power that seemed for a time eternal. It would speak less of the cost, of jaws grown too heavy for speech, of children born too frail to live, of women like Margarita bound by duty to rooms they would never leave, whose names would fade from the living long before they faded from portraits. Inside Vienna's palaces, those portraits remained, hung in gilded frames, staring from walls lined with silk and gold, eyes unblinking, watching as years passed, as emperors came and went, as history marched on without them, silent witnesses to a dynasty's slow decline. Leopold ruled on as was expected. He raised new heirs, fought new wars, signed new treaties. Yet sometimes, when he passed through the gardens where Margarita had once sat wrapped in shawls against the cold, he paused, just briefly, just long enough to remember. And in that pause lay the truth of all fading empires, that even those who seem immortal will one day become only stories told beneath painted ceilings, names carved in stone beneath dust-covered banners. The House of Habsburg would endure a little longer, but history had already decided what it would remember. Not the silence, not the loneliness, not the girls who died too young. Only the glory, only the crowns, only the fading light of an empire already beginning to dim. The story does not truly end with Margarita. In fact, it would be her younger brother, Charles II of Spain, who would become the final tragic symbol of this decaying bloodline. If Margarita's life had been one of quiet resignation, of a body worn thin by duty and a childhood sacrificed to politics, then Charles would embody the inevitable conclusion of generations of decisions made in the name of royal blood. Charles was born sickly frail and marked from the beginning by the toll of centuries of intermarriage. His jaw, his posture, his mind, his very existence carried the visible scars of a family tree, so twisted it could no longer support its own weight. He lived a life of isolation, surrounded by caretakers, priests, and ministers who whispered of his failings while smiling to his face. He reigned in name, only a king trapped in a body too weak to fulfill his role. His every breath a struggle against the inheritance written into his bones. Historians would look back on him and call him the last Habsburg King of Spain. They would point to his childless marriage, to the wars of succession that followed his death, and to the way an entire empire fractured under the strain of bloodlines too tightly bound. But behind these cold facts, there remained the tragedy of a man who had never been given a chance. Like Margarita, Charles was born into a world where his path had been written long before he took his first breath. One cannot help but wonder, were they ever truly more than children bound to a throne, children dressed in silk and crowned in gold, but shackled by expectations, older than they were, trapped beneath the weight of dynasties that valued bloodlines above happiness, above health, above life itself? What might Margarita have been had she been allowed to live freely, not as a daughter of Spain or an empress of Austria, but simply as herself? Could she have found joy in quiet gardens, in music and motherhood, free from fear? Could she have laughed without watching her? Every word danced without considering who was watching. Could she have grown old beside someone who loved her, not for her ancestry, but for her heart? We cannot know. History does not record the lives not lived. The future's never written. It keeps only what was not, what could have been. But their story, Margarita's, Charles's, the Habsburgs, remains a somber lesson written between the lines of history books. This is what happens when power is valued above all else. This is what centuries of cousin marrying, cousin uncle, marrying niece leads to. Not strength, not immortality, but frailty, isolation, loneliness behind closed doors, in darkened halls, beneath the gaze of portraits that watch but do not see. The Habsburgs were not the only European dynasty to suffer from this practice, but they became the most infamous example. Their legacy was written not just in battles won or territories gained, but in the faces of children born weaker with each passing generation. Margarita, Charles, countless others whose names history has already begun to forget. And so, we step quietly away from their story now. We leave Leopold and Margarita in their painted frame, forever preserved in oil and varnish beneath a light that grows softer each year. We leave Charles in the history books, the tragic full stop at the end of a dynasty that believed itself eternal. Perhaps in some gentler corner of history, they might have found happiness. But here in this world, they were only ever heirs, pawns dressed as kings and queens, children never given the freedom to choose. And now it is time to let them rest. Let the halls of Vienna grow silent. Let the candles burn low. Let the portraits keep their silent vigil beneath layers of dust and time. Close your eyes. Breathe softly. There is nothing more to see here. Only a quiet lesson, wrapped in velvet and gold tucked away behind the walls of history. Sleep well. Let them fade into dreams, into stillness, where the burdens of crowns and bloodlines no longer matter. Good night.